Hello, everybody. Welcome to Village Well. So someone just said this is a beautiful store, and I said it's most beautiful when it's full of all these people. It's the reason that I created this shop was to get people together to hear interesting people talk about interesting and important things, so we can all be smarter, more inspired citizens. And so I was thrilled sometime earlier this year, maybe last year, when Ann was in the shop and introduced herself and told me she was an artist. And I said, I love to highlight local artists in the shop. What does your work look like? And she showed me some pictures. And I said, that's beautiful. We should do something. And finally, this has come together. So it took a little while, but I'm glad that it did. So Ann Wolken is a local artist who many of you know, I'm sure. She is a figurative artist living in Los Angeles. She attended Smith College in the 1960s and has worked in Los Angeles since the 1970s. Her work traces a story of recovery from anger, grief, and loss, the emotions that arose from losing her mother at such a young age. Her catalog of art illustrates that recovery process through themes of people, maternity, feminism, and spirituality. And what we decided that she's going to talk about today is the book 9th Street Women, the story of 5 modern female artists who came to prominence in the 1960s, and they really broke through and became the first really prominent female artists in this country ever. And it was a movement, and this book that tells the story of it was very inspiring to Anne because of her own experience and that of her mother, who was an artist and really couldn't fully express herself and get the renown that she deserved in her lifestyle because of sexism. So we found the perfect interviewer for Anne, her daughter, Cassandra McGrath, also known by her songwriting moniker of Cassandra Violet. She is an educator, creative writing instructor, and a musician, and she was featured in the 2021 movie Pig. She grew up in a house in Los Angeles full of her mother's paintings, and we are honored to have her here to interview her mother and get this story out. So thank you so much for coming and joining us, and would you join me in giving them a warm welcome?
All right, welcome everyone. Okay, I'm interviewing my own mom. It's cool. All right, so this is an interview about the book 9th Street Women, and I know that you are a big fan of this book. So I would like you to tell the audience and me, how did you come to read this book, Mom?
Well,
Talk into the mic.
okay. I want Stephen. Can you hear me? Okay. I saw the book in hardback at first, and I said no. I can never read this book, and so I left it go, and then I rented it at the library. And it was too short a time, and I knew I couldn't read the book. But then when it came out in paperback, I bought this book. And that was in 2020. And I was having a lot of time on my hands. And it was summer, and it was June. And so I just sat there in my studio and I read the book. And I was surprised because when I got into it, I fell in love with the book and I fell in love with these women. And I didn't anticipate that I would feel so connected to them. But I did.
Oh, thank you. It is a very lengthy book. Lengthy tome. So after reading this book during the pandemic, so you said it was really affecting. So how did it affect you? Why did you like it so much?
Well, I loved this book because these women weren't just artists, they were people. And they opened a world that I didn't really know. Because growing up this particular part of American history was really shunned in my family because it was during the war. And my mother died in 1954. And so I was just kind of thinking that that was a place I wouldn't go, that I wouldn't explore. And one of the things that happened as I got into this book was that my late brother's photographs that he'd kept in his house came to me, and when the house was being sold in Connecticut. And in some kind of random way, I was archiving some of the photos, and this photo came into came into my vision really around this time. And this was my own mother in 1943, around the time of that takes place in this book. And she was only 19 then. And the guy in the center of the picture is a man named Philip Pearlstein, who later on became a pretty well-known artist in New York City.
Thank you. So speaking about the women in the book, what did it take for these women at the time to become the artists that they became?
Well, that's another thing about this book that really engaged me. These women were really, really shocking to me, their lives. They made decisions that were radical at the time, but in hindsight, from my point of view, reading them today, it feels very, very dangerous, honestly, the way they lived.
Like intentionally so?
I don't know that they saw it that way, because at that time, all of these artists were congregated in New York City, and they all fed off of each other. And that was their life, and they were really excited about living like this. Mm. But I don't believe I've ever lived that close to this kind of dangerous lifestyle, honestly. I mean, I've talked about this before, but as you know, during this time, there was no birth control, and they lived a very promiscuous lifestyle, and many of them had multiple abortions. Not only that, they were chain smokers, and they were like incredible alcoholics. And so, I mean, they deteriorated, actually. Like, I mean, it was something that was really romantic and beautiful in the pictures when they were young. And then as they got older, they had more difficulties.
Which woman's story was the most inspiring to you?
Well, they were all really inspiring to me, but if I had to pick one woman out, many of you already know that I really admire the artwork of Joan Mitchell. She is a great American artist, probably one of the greatest American artists of the 21st century, of the 20th century. Thank you. You found the picture. The thing is that we just had, and if you know me, you know I told everyone to go see the show. Huge retrospective of her work. And there's so many things about it, but they're all really important women artists. Lee Krasner, as you know, was married to Jackson Pollock, and she was an incredible artist in her own right. And when he died, when he was only 44, she lived like 30 more years and kept painting, and her work is great. And we have right here in this bookstore a wonderful book by Gail Levin all about her. The lucky thing about her, Lee Krasner, was that she stayed married. So she inherited absolutely all Jackson's work and supported herself and really saw to it that it was placed really well. Her work was really, in her very old age, she was given some recognition. But today, there's a great piece at the County Museum, that great biography, and it's all over the world.
What about the artist Grace Hartigan?
Grace Hartigan is someone I don't know very well of all the women. She was very successful when she was young. She was really beautiful. And would you read the poem, Cassie?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes. So could you tell us a little bit about Grace Hartigan's relationship with the poet Frank O'Hara?
Well, that was the most important relationship in Grace Hartigan's life, although she was married 4 times, not as, of course, to Frank O'Hara, who was gay. But they had a kind of love, like a passion almost of artistic creation. And so why don't you read that poem?
Okay. All right. This is a poem that that Frank O'Hara wrote to Grace Hartigan, right?
Yeah.
Okay. It's called For Grace After a Party. You do not always know what I am feeling. Last night in the warm spring air, while I was blazing my tirade against someone who doesn't interest me, it was love for you that set me afire. And isn't it odd? For in rooms full of strangers, my most tender feelings writhe and bear the fruit of screaming. Put out your hand. Isn't there an ashtray suddenly there beside the bed? And someone you love enters the room and says, "Wouldn't you like the eggs a little different today?" And when they arrive, they are just plain scrambled eggs, and the warm weather is holding. That's that poem.
Frank O'Hara, yeah. Frank O'Hara was an incredible inspiration, muse for all the artists of that era. And to this day, I have a wonderful collection of his work.
I have another question for you, Mom. How did this book relate to your personal story of losing your mother in 1954?
Well, that is something that I am just realizing more and more. And my sponsor, Sheila, is here. And I have been working on losing my mother in all kinds of ways, among them in Al-Anon. So I'm really happy she's here. And yeah, losing my mother was really hard, and all of my work's been about it. And she was an artist. And could you show some of her work? You know, find the, we sort of
Next one.
interrupted. Yeah, these are all the pictures I have over here.
Oh,
But we can come back. Do you want me to talk about them now? Or okay. Well, that's Grace Hartigan that I did with Frank. Can you find my mother's story, the story of my mother? My mother died in 1954, as I said, and she had her work framed after she died when I was 6 years old, and they had a show at the Pittsburgh Plan for Art. You can't find the work? Okay. And my Uncle Mark came over and framed them. I was just a tiny little girl. And they were around the house my entire life until I left Pittsburgh to go to Smith College when I was 17 years old. And they were all about Pittsburgh, but I was really grateful to have those pieces in my home. And I think, in a way, they kept me close to my mother. And so a part of her was still there while I was growing up the whole time. But naturally, being a little girl, you want a real mother instead of paintings. But it was a big help to me. But she didn't know, of course, that she would be the only artist I would ever know growing up until I went to Smith College. And when I went to Smith College in 1965, there were no women artists at all in any of the books or in any of the galleries, and it was a women's college. There were no women art teachers, zero. Jansen, the textbook, as many of you know that study art, not a single woman in the book. My painting teacher, who happened to also be Joan Mitchell's painting teacher, when he started, she was one of his first students, and when he was almost retired, I was one of his last students. And he mentioned there really should be a book on Mary Cassatt, but at that time, there was not one single book on Mary Cassatt.
I have a question, Mom.
Yes.
So like you sort of mentioned to me that you feel like the women in this book are kind of like mothering you, like in a sense that they're like, that you sort of saw your mother in them. Can you speak on that?
Yes. I feel we left out some of the women. We'll have to return to them for Tom's slideshow. But, well, I think that's a good point, Cassie, because it's like more meaningful to me because it wasn't there before. In other words, here I was, this little girl whose mother's work was all over the house, but no other women at all in any of the museums. And then I go to Smith College, I'm supposedly studying art, no women teachers, no women artists in the museum there. So having this now, it's like all of a sudden, I remember when I came to meet Jen here at this bookstore and how excited I was, and I said, you should get all these books. You should get, all of them because they're coming out. They're coming out right now. And I don't think she realized how like stunned I was. Like every time I would go to a museum, I would see more books about women. And it was like, why now? Why all of a sudden? And it was just, now for some reason. And that's why you can't really control time and how things are recognized and when they're recognized. And I think that it's kind of feeds a part of me that in a way it was always empty, was always without closure. And the world did that. But fortunately, because of all the work I'd done on my personal life, I can acknowledge it. And that is the biggest gift that I owe my friends, that I owe my sponsor, that, I owe everyone, because I think that is something that we all have to work at, to allow the light to come in. Okay, now there are women in museums. You can go to the Museum of Modern Art, and there are plenty of women in their new reopened gallery. And you can go to Lackman, you can see Lee Krasner, and you can see Helen Frankenthaler. I mean, you know, and it's fantastic.
All right. Well, I think that's all of the questions that I have, but maybe you could go through some of the artists. I just want to say it's cool. I grew up in a house with your paintings around. My dad's also an artist, and I think it's just cool. It's cool to get to interview my own mom about it. So, yeah, it's neat. I think you're really cool.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. So, yeah.
Well, I just want to say a couple more words about the artists we left out.
Yeah, we left out some artists.
Two artists. Even though, we didn't mention Helen Frankenthaler. And Helen Frankenthaler...
Is that her, Mom? Is that her?
Yes.
Okay.
And she was known for having invented the stain paintings in art. And she was somebody who did get early success. She had a very successful art critic boyfriend, Clement Greenberg, and Clement Greenberg sort of betrayed Helen Frankenthaler, and he had a key to her studio, and he let this guy Morris Lewis in there, and he stole her technique of stain paintings, and so he became famous. She was pretty well known. Too, but she never got the credit for that whole stain painting thing. And her paintings by the other women were not always that well received. Joan Mitchell, who I talk a lot about because she is such a great artist, was very dismissive of Helen Frankenthaler's work and called them Kotex paintings. But they were nevertheless good friends in a certain kind of frenemy way, and they hung each other's art. And it's really cheerful to see them all together in 9th Street Women. And I'm sure many of you have aunts and cousins in pictures in your home that have the same styles as these women. And it's very romantic to see them laughing and being so happy hanging each other's artwork.
Which other women would you like to discuss?
Well, I'm going to wrap it up. I think there's a lot to say about these women. I'm going to end it, I think, with Joan Mitchell, who is a really interesting artist. Because she started out at Smith, where I did.
Was that your painting that you did of her?
Yes. Now, this is a great one. So that's because she was so affected by her father. Her father, Jimmy, was very narcissistic and used Joan to get acclaim for himself. And that was similar to my father. And he made her, do tricks for him. She became an equestrian champion. She was a figure skater champion. And then she hurt her leg, and she said to her father, "Daddy, I can't get any more championships for you." And she was always trying, though, nevertheless, to please her father. And yet, another thing about her, she had a sequence of very influential men, boyfriends, and husbands. The first was Barney Rossett, who founded Grove Press. and famous publishing company. And another one of her husbands was Robert Motherwell, who was also a really famous artist. But what happened, and I'm even forgetting her French long-standing affair with Jean-Paul Réalpal, and all these men totally occupied her for forever, most of her life. And she went to France. She was an heiress. She went to France and bought this huge estate, La Tour, where Monet's once lived. And interestingly enough, all of these men left her, including Jean-Paul, who left her with her own assistant. He took her and left. And she was left there with this really big estate, this heiress, and she had lots of dogs. Oh, I have the other one has dogs in it. And so she was alone finally, and she started to sponsor young women to come and help her in her studio. And in her new catalog, which I highly recommend, from the retrospective, they give very moving tributes to her. And they say she was doing her very best work when all these men left her. And that is true, because what happened to her was, even though she was at the cutting edge of the New York scene, really, when she went to Europe, she became incredibly indebted to Vincent van Gogh. And if you really look at her paintings, you can see Vincent van Gogh's strokes kind of enlarged in her paintings. And it's almost like, they've shown them. It's obvious that she was incredibly influenced by him. And another thing that's really moving, that makes her work incredibly transcendent, is that a lot of these really famous art figures at this time, and people that had helped her tremendously, started to die. And she began to make these incredible triptychs and large paintings in tribute to these wonderful art people that she was so indebted to. And so her work has a beautiful arc to it, and her late work is incredible. I did want to say one thing about making these paintings. I made them for this program, for this bookstore, and I wanted to honor one of my teachers, Jim Finley, because in the process of making them, I came to appreciate these women more. And what Jim says, he says, read a passage that you really want to absorb into yourself, and then write it in your own words, and then take it and put it in your pocket. And I think that's really helpful. So I wonder if I'll keep doing that. Yeah, that's them in my studio. That's good, Tom. So yeah, so it's really helpful. I don't know if I'll do any more pieces on them, but I was surprised at how helpful that is to do.
Okay.
All right. Is that about it?
I guess so. Okay.
Does anybody have any questions? Any questions? No?
So if we went to Smith College, there were no women professors, no women artists, and you were there for art, what did they expect your role as an artist to be?
Yeah, it wasn't helpful. They said, get married.
So it was just like they considered it for you just to be a hobby.
Well, you know, I honestly don't know what they thought, but I did get a good education there. I can't complain. Yes.
What were a couple of turning points do you think that kind of marked that shift from there being no female representation at the college to increasing representation? Are there a couple of maybe events that you can think of that you think were particularly influential in making that change in the university?
Honestly, I had long left. I graduated a year early because I didn't really want to stay there any longer. But yeah, when I was there, it was the way it was for a long time. I mean, it was the Vietnam War. People were fasting. That was what they were worried about. I was aware of it. But, yeah, no, I don't know.
Any other questions?
Julie. Hi, Julie.
I don't know how recently you finished this, but what are you working on now?
Well, no, I just finished this, but in fact, I was a little bit late getting this here, and Jen said, "Well, this program's happening. I mean, I want to like promote it. Why aren't you having these things here?" And I said, "Well, I'm making them."
Good. Well, I've enjoyed your work and the fact that your work is serious. I think is really interesting. So I look forward to your next one.
Well, I feel honored to be here tonight and thank Jen. And also, I am looking for a venue to have a real art show, you know, with like gallery walls and things. So if you have any suggestions on that. But having all my friends here is really wonderful. Thank you so much for coming.
Yay, thank you.